Hi everyone. I hope you all are having a fantastic day. I'm having a great day. Happens to be one of my days off from work at the moment. And I happen to be thinking about tires and specifically the aspect ratio of tires. And for those who aren't super familiar with the topic, the aspect ratio of a tire is essentially a difference between what's called the section width of the tire. You could almost just call it the width of the tire, but technically the section width. That ratio compared to essentially the section height of the tire. So what we're talking about is how thick the tire is compared to how wide the tire is. So one example would be if you have a really wide tire, like a 255 wide. 255 means 255 millimeters, which happens to be almost exactly 10 inches wide, so a pretty wide tire. If the aspect ratio of that tire is 25, for example, which would be a very low profile tire, then that means with the ratio, we would be looking at 25% of the 255 millimeters would be the height. So another way of saying that is with a 25 aspect ratio tire, it's going to be only 25% as thick or tall above the rim as it is wide, which would be a very low profile tire. Now you may be wondering, for those who aren't familiar with this, well, what is the difference between a low profile tire and a high profile tire in definition? Well, from research that I have found on excellent websites such as TireRack.com, and then watching videos such as various tire videos from Engineering Explained, and there are many excellent YouTube videos out there that go into a lot more depth with many examples of high profile versus low profile and essentially everything in between. But if you want to dig deeper, definitely check out some of those articles. I would start with TireRack.com. You could even do a Wikipedia search or a general Google search, for example, to find out more about high versus low profile tires and to read about the pros and cons. But in case you're wondering, this video is mostly just to give my perspective on high versus low profile tires and what my personal preference tends to be and why I might choose one versus another, or in some cases go with high, or in other cases go with low profile tires. Alright, so a little bit more about the definition. So generally speaking, from what I have found, low profile tires are those that have a ratio of 50% or less, especially less than 50%. So in other words, for example, 225/45 tires. That would mean the width is 225 millimeters, which would be roughly 9 inches. And if the aspect ratio is 45, then that means the tire is 45% as thick, if you want to call it that, as it is wide. So that would be a low profile tire, but very close to borderline. So borderline would be at a 50 aspect ratio, which is 50% as tall or thick as it is wide. All right, so that being the case, a high profile tire would be a tire that is generally above that 50%. So especially back in the 70s and 80s, it was very common to have a tire be like 65 or 75% as tall above the rim or thick with that rubber. If you're thinking of the thickness between the rubber and the road, so to speak, the rubber meets the road between the rim and the road, all you have is the air in the tire and the rubber. So anyhow, I know that came across a little bit funny the way I worded that, but the basic idea is the amount of rubber that's meeting that road between the rim and the pavement, the tarmac, whatever you want to call it, well, that thickness is your aspect ratio. Okay, so enough of me rambling on about that. So, generally speaking, what are some pros and cons that I am personally aware of? Well, if you have that higher, that thicker aspect ratio, generally speaking, of course, each tire and each manufacturer, etc., is going to be a little bit different. There are many, many variables here, but generally speaking, you're going to get a softer ride if you have that higher aspect ratio. And you're going to have, generally speaking, less road noise, although road noise is rather subjective and there are many, many different variables that can affect road noise besides just the aspect ratio of the tires. There can be things like the particular tire compound. That's going to have a lot to do with it. The tread pattern is going to have a whole lot to do with it. And then there's a whole separate topic about knobby off-road tires and how those contribute to noise, even if they are that high aspect ratio. One thing to keep in mind is the stiffness of the sidewall. Even if it is a high aspect ratio, if it's a stiff sidewall for certain off-road capabilities, etc., that's going to have an effect on ride, on road noise, and so forth. All right, so general pros to that higher aspect ratio, we're talking about softer ride and in certain cases less road noise. Whereas it's also going to provide a little bit more insurance, if you want to call it that, against tire damage. So if you go up against a curb with a high profile tire, you're just going to scrape up the rubber a little bit. Generally speaking, if it's just a little parking maneuver and you're not ramming into something. But if you have the low profile tires, you're going to get generally better steering feel. You'll feel a lot more like you are connected directly to the road as you're steering. You're going to feel each individual imperfection in the road, which can give you a really great feel if you're trying to do some sporty driving, if you're doing what some people call canyon carving, going around the twisty roads and all of that. So that's something to keep in mind. Those low profile tires, literally some can be about like this in their profile, some even thinner than that. But with that, that's the main advantage besides styling. Some people love the look of those low profile tires, and I will say I do like the look in certain cases of the low profile tires versus the high profile. Depending on the rest of the vehicle, the year, make and model of vehicle, is it more sporty in its appearance? Is it supposed to be ultra modern? If you look at the sketches of the concept cars, almost always they have like what almost looks like painted on rubber on the rims as opposed to actually beefy rubber of any kind. So that's kind of a trend in that style. It seems like the more futuristic it is, the thinner the sidewalls have to be. Well, that's not my personal preference, but it's a thing. All right. So advantages, steering feel, and subjectively, a certain look to the tires. It can look like it fits better, it's more futuristic, it's more sporty, etc. in individual opinions and so forth. The disadvantage of the low profile tires are you have a higher chance of rim damage. You're going to get a lot rougher ride, generally speaking. Some of this can be compensated with other suspension factors and so forth. But keep in mind, your first defense, if you want to call it that, in your suspension is the amount of air and rubber that is between the rim and the road. So firmer ride and more likelihood of rim damage from potholes and from parking next to a curb, etc., if you have the low profile. And then the opposite with the high profile. You have less steering feel, generally speaking, but you have a softer ride and much more immunity to potholes and bumps and rubbing up against the curb and potentially damaging a rim. A rim, depending on the vehicle, may be $1,000 to replace. A tire, those generally aren't cheap, but a typical tire is going to be maybe $150 or $200 for a nice tire. can be a little bit more, a little bit less. Obviously, prices are changing so much these days, and here in 2023, things seem to keep going up, up, up here in the United States and in most parts of the world, I would say, but that's another topic. Anyhow, in summary, lower profile tires, better looks subjectively, depending on your opinion, and better handling, better road feel. Higher profile tires, much softer ride, much less chance of damage. So, what's my preference? My preference is medium to high profile tires. I like the look of them in many cases, as long as the rims and the rest of the vehicle seem to fit the tire. And I prefer stock tires, so I would rather choose a medium or high profile tire stock and not necessarily do anything aftermarket. So I like that, and you can still get sporty tires that are performance all season, or even performance summer tires that are at least a medium aspect ratio, or some of the lower high profile tires, if you want to call it that. And that way you can enjoy the ride a little bit more, especially if it's a daily commuter car or other like sporty SUV, something like that. That's really my preference. And so I'm talking about an aspect ratio of around anywhere from 50 to 60, in certain cases even 65. That would be my personal ideal. If the rest of the car is made to fit that, and especially if you have tires that give you good grip and good handling characteristics, that would be my ideal. So I feel like that's the best of both worlds, somewhere in that general vicinity, around a 50 to a 65. If I had to pick a perfect one, so to speak, of course, a lot of variables here, but if I had to pick a perfect one, I would say probably about a 55 would be my perfect aspect ratio. All right. Well, thank you all for listening to this. And again, be sure to do your own research if you want to dig deeper. And one other thing I will mention, generally speaking, if you have smaller rims and larger tires so that the tire diameter overall is the same, which is what you tend to get when you are choosing a different aspect ratio for a certain vehicle, you may have an 18-inch rim, a 19-inch rim, and a 20-inch rim option, hypothetically. Well, the actual diameter and circumference of the tires are generally going to be the same, so that your odometer, your speedometer, and so forth can be the same with vehicle A versus vehicle B, but the tires are going to be a different aspect ratio. So you're going to have a smaller rim with thicker tires with the high ratio. You're going to have a larger rim with thinner tires with the lower aspect ratio, those low profile tires. And so when you do that, you have more what's called unsprung weight. And that means you have more rim, more metal, so to speak, that is around each of the four corners of your vehicle. And the vehicle has to overcome inertia to be able to start those tires, those wheels rolling, and it's going to take more force potentially to slow down, and a lot of different things are affected when you have more unsprung mass. Whereas if you just have air and rubber, yes, that weighs something, but it generally weighs less than a rim that's sturdy enough to support a vehicle. Yes, there are very lightweight rims you can get to offset this and so forth, but generally speaking, because there is less unsprung mass when you have a thicker tire and a smaller rim, then you can generally get better fuel economy that way as well with those higher profile tires. So that's another side effect, that's a positive side effect of having the high profile tires. So on that note, I'm going to say goodbye for now. Thanks for those of you who took the time to watch this entire video, about 14 and a half minutes so far. Thanks again, and I appreciate you all watching C.A.R.S. Have a great rest of your day.